Fauxlosophers.
Fauxlosophers.
I'm going to let you start us off, David, since this is kind of your thing.
Okay, so for the next 4 episodes, probably, we will be talking about Christianity, particularly an argument, a long-form argument against Christianity. So one thing, there's 2 things that are important to mention before we really get started into any arguments, which is that we want to remind our listeners, or any new listeners who may be directed to this recording by some other regular listener of the show, that you need to be careful not to attach your beliefs to your identity. Because, remember, beliefs are just ideas that we hold to be true in our minds. They're not part of us as people, no matter how long we have carried them for, or how many resources we have invested into those beliefs. They are transient characteristics of ourselves that can come and go. And arguing against a belief is not attacking the character of a person who holds it. Not necessarily, anyway. And then secondly, this argument will be delivered against Christian fundamentalism primarily. Now, by fundamentalism, I mean the kind of religion that has a connotation which indicates unwavering attachment to a set of irreducible beliefs. So the people who take as their first principle philosophically that the doctrines of Christianity are true, the Bible is true, things like that. And this argument may or may not apply to more moderate Christians. And the reason I say may or may not is because moderate Christianity can be anywhere from someone who, believes that, everything in the Bible is true, but thinks that it's because it has merits in science or something like that. Or it could be all the way down to someone who most people would not consider to be a Christian, but who calls themselves Christians because they like the stories. So because the range there is so broad, I can't say how it will or will not apply to moderate Christians. Joe, is there anything you'd like to say?
Yeah, I think you wrapped it up pretty well in a nutshell. We do talk at some length in a previous episode about separating your beliefs from your identity. And I think we even mentioned last episode that we do this to ourselves. By calling yourself a Christian, you are saying that you are the belief.
Right.
And
you attach it to yourself. You're not a person who believes in Christianity. You're a Christian. And so you absorb the identity.
Right. And I hope it will be evident that we don't mean to attack anyone in person, or we're not making an argument against a person. We're not making arguments against people. We're making arguments against ideas. And that's something that we really want to make sure that we never lose sight of. That ultimately, we're doing this to try to find the truth. And we're trying to move closer to the truth. And the reason we're doing this is in that vein, even if it's a slightly different format. And that's why I just wanted to make that caveat. I mean, you kind of already did, but I wanted to say it myself, because the last thing I want is for someone to watch this or hear this and walk away feeling like we were speaking directly to them about them, whereas we really are just trying to look at the belief on its own merits.
Right. This is an examination of a belief, or really set of beliefs.
Right.
Not about people who hold the belief. Because people may hold one or more of these beliefs for various reasons. And in context, they may have good reasons. Or they may not. But it's not about the people who hold the beliefs or why they hold the beliefs. It's about the belief itself, or set of beliefs on its own merits.
That's correct. The only real difference, I guess, that makes this from anything we normally do is that we're making assertions and we're taking a position in the argument.
Right. This will be different from our normal types of discussions in which we begin with questions and see where they take us. This will be presenting an argument, but it is important, as was mentioned at the end of the last episode, that we are not claiming to be the arbiters of truth, that this is merely an argument or a set of arguments, and we welcome any criticism against these arguments as long as they are made in good faith.
Exactly. And that's one other thing to keep in mind is that, we are open to feedback, and we will legitimately look forward to answering any legitimate criticism. That's something we haven't had too much to deal with to this point, but I know that we would, and that's something we look forward to one day, because as much as we love hearing the sounds of our own voices, it's good to know that there are others out there who even disagree with us, and that they gave their time to us.
Right.
So, with that all being said, David, I think you should just launch right into it. I think we're ready to go.
So, for this first installment in this series, I want to talk about common reasons that people hold a belief in Christianity, and what keeps people from thinking reasonably about their beliefs. So this will not be against the belief itself, but rather things to do with the belief. And so, firstly, I'd like to address that. What really? Why do myths exist in the first place? And I'm using the technical definition of myth, which is a traditional story, especially one concerning the early history of a people or explaining a natural or social phenomenon, and typically involving supernatural beings or events. This is definitely true of the Old Testament and largely the New Testament as well. So why do myths exist? And I submit that for psychological reasons, or rather in a psychological sense, myths exist to explain things. This is especially potent to children who may ask very difficult questions that for a very long time, and even still today, parents could not give a real answer to because we didn't have an explanation available. And so, where did all of the life come from? Why am I here? These are hard questions to answer, especially, just a few hundred years ago. And so it's easy to say, well, God did it. Now, it's not true for most people today, I don't think, that parents are looking for a cop-out explanation and so tell their kids to believe in God. I don't think that that's how that works. I think that that may have something to do with where these myths came from to begin with, but I think that it's easier to appreciate this if you think about it in terms of an anecdote. So think about, imagine you're a prehistoric human. Okay, you're living somewhere in Africa, probably, and you have to contend on a regular basis with storms and disasters and things like this. And imagine knowing basically nothing about how the world or the universe works, and you see things like the stars up in the sky, or you see the intimidating clouds roll in and powerful bolts of lightning, and the ground literally shakes beneath your feet, and you wonder where these things come from, and without any real guidance, your mind can easily wander into many strange places. And this is why we see in these cultures that have survived in Africa since those times, there are still traditional cultures which think about these things in terms of separate deities which command the great forces at play here. And I'll spare a long history of religion and theism here that's not really relevant, but this is to get the idea of why do we care about myths and why do we hold on to them, and why did we feel in the first place they had any sort of explanatory power?
Right. I feel like there's also this other tendency that human beings tend to have, that our memories and a lot of the way we communicate is via narrative. You'll find it's a lot easier to memorize things or to remember things when they're set to tunes or they're set to a story. And oftentimes when we try to teach children lessons, we teach them in parables, or you read them a little kid's storybook that imparts a lesson. And so it's not only these misunderstandings from the myth in their origin, but it's as they're passed from, pre-writing societies forward, it's a lot easier to personify things in narrative as well. And that's why I think it's really tempting and easy to be able to understand some religious, stories, and they're taking them as a truth because they're formulated that way into a narrative to be very easily digested by human beings. Because narrative is the way really by which we commit our experiences and perspectives to reality, to memory, and then are able to recall them. So I just wanted to make that note as well about bringing them forward.
Right. But a problem here is that this, thinking about myths and thinking that they have true explanatory power leads to some problems. Because saying that, I don't understand what causes these fantastic and awesome events, and I propose that there are one or more gods doing it. It's not a real explanation. It's a guess. But it's a guess which persists through tradition, and so it becomes traditional to accept this guess as though it is fact.
Right.
And so when we think about things in that way, when someone comes along and attempts to actually explain such phenomena, we tend to, in defense of our original conclusion, argue against this explanation, as if it validates our previous conclusion, when it doesn't, because the previous conclusion was made upon a fallacy in the first place, namely an argument from ignorance, that we don't know why this is happening, therefore this explanation, any explanation will do, whatever we come up with first.
That's fallacious, though, in a way. Well, that can lead quickly into a fallacious argument. I'm not meaning to jump the gun on you.
Okay.
But, typically speaking, when it's always been understood a certain way, there's several different fallacies that kind of fall into bed here.
Sure.
When you say, well, it's always just been known this way, that's the appeal to tradition. And when people generally say, well, it's always been this way, and it's very obvious or easy to understand, then it's almost like the inverse of implying the fallacy, where, like, I forget the name of the fallacy, but it's the one where it's like, well, I can't understand anything other than that, so it can't be true or real.
The argument from personal incredulity?
Yes,
yeah,
that's what it is. And not only that, but it's holding one idea up and almost preparing you to lead into why this is the only good idea and that all of the others are lopped together as wrong or bad, taking a continuum of possibilities and summing them down into a dichotomy.
Right. And this way of thinking leads to things like you'll see a lot of Christians today, very active Christians, theologians, who will argue against, say, evolution as a theory of the origin of species, as if arguing against evolution is a legitimate argument for the creationism which they believe. disproving another explanation is not support of your own. Your own explanation can only be supported on its own merits and evidence which we find which supports it. And while there are good reasons to challenge evolution, I think, but these reasons should be scientifically motivated. By attempting to disprove evolution, we may discover something very important.
Right, and the point shouldn't be to try to disprove it to replace it with something you already have in your back pocket.
Right, but to find something new.
Right, and I think that's the biggest thing about
Or
science.
at least, at the very least, at the minimum, if we found something which totally pulled the rug out from under our current evolutionary theory, unlikely, but it could happen. If that happened, then and in the process we did not discover some new insight into the origin of species, then at least we've made some progress by not pursuing a path we know to be wrong. I think an important thing here is that when we have a conclusion already, and we have it in our heads that if we can disprove other conclusions, then that validates our own conclusion. This sets us up to be against the ideas which give us progress in our societies, like science. Because if we constantly do this, if we're constantly rejecting new explanations which conflict with our existing conclusions, and when we hear a new explanation, the first thing we want to do is invalidate it rather than look at what it might have to offer on its own merits. We are robbing ourselves the opportunity to learn more for real about how our universe works. And so for this reason, I submit that such arguments of ignorance are a dead end. That they can't stand on their own merits because they are based on a guess.
Well, let's talk about what we're talking about, really. Like, we're kind of headed towards really describing out, epistemology in a way. Like, in general, it kind of goes along with this, and these are kind of its forming tenets. But something we've mentioned before is that, I would assert that it's been pretty clear that we hold the position that there are two types of things that can be known: knowledge, which are things you know beyond a shadow of a doubt, and these are things that I say in the technical sense are factual, or things that are argued to be the most true, and then there are things that you believe, and those things don't really overlap. You don't really need. I know you. I don't believe that you exist. Like, that would be a weird thing to say. Obviously I do, but it's beyond that. It's about knowing, and believing is different. And building your belief system off of things that you know to be true is different than building it off of things that you believe to be true, and compounding beliefs as opposed to compounding it on knowledge. And that's the thing where, this really is the limit of what we can do. And when you sit around and you proselytize or you talk about something, you can only look at knowledge that other people have actually physically walked outside and done, and performed science, or witnessed for, one-on-one. And, that's why it's, whenever people tell me that they know that this is true, they just know it, well, how?
You don't just know something.
Exactly. And
you have to know something for a reason.
And that's why when you look at most people who do like street epistemology, for example, they always generally bring up confidence as a replacement for whether you know something or not. Because knowing or not is binary. Most people will err and say that they do know something when they just might be pretty confident in it. And where, especially people in religious contexts, it's all about knowing. It's not about just necessarily your confidence in whether you know or not. It's like, do you know this? Do you know, in Christianity's case, do you know Christ? It's not, do you believe in Christ? Most often the phrase is actually, do you know him? And it's slightly different than that. But in epistemology, we generally talk about, what is your confidence in this? Because that is the way by which you can kind of bridge the gap when you start bringing things like science and religion into the same camp and start discussing their merits back and forth.
Right.
It's a lot easier to do when you're speaking a more common language and you're not using language that's dogmatic or strictly technical. So,
right.
But yeah, I would agree that anytime that you say, well, I know this for sure, or, I'm 100% confident, or that I know, and then I'm building my belief system on something that I know but I can't prove it, it's, there's bound to be failure. Because you're setting, it's, as to quote it back, it's like building your house on sand, but.
And, and another thing is that I'm not necessarily submitting that just because you can't prove something means that it's not true.
Right.
That's not necessarily the case. There are plenty of things that are true that can't be proven. If a crime occurs in a sufficiently secluded area without cameras or recorders or anything like that, and the victim of the crime is left with no marks and is not killed, it did happen, but they can't prove it. So this is not discounting that particularly or necessarily, but the problem is that when we're talking about things of this magnitude of importance in our lives, namely the principles which guide our lives, such as a religion, then we need to have a high degree of scrutiny against them, and they need to withstand the test of time and also be internally consistent. And lacking these things, we need to seriously question whether we have good reason to believe them, and we'll get to that later.
Sure. I do want to interject for a moment. I would like to go a little into why it's important. Like you say that religious belief is, what you believe has certain magnitude, and that this is of great magnitude.
Mm-hmm.
And while I don't doubt that most fundamentalists would agree with you that yes, this is of a great magnitude, they think that for a different reason, perhaps. We may not have to justify this, because the people I think we might just be specifically targeting are the fundamentalists. But for those out there who may be apothetists, they're apathetic. I think that's how you pronounce the word. I don't really know. They're apathetic to it. Why does any of this matter? It doesn't seem to matter in my daily life. And that could be from, I think we should do it some justice and talk about why it really is important, even if we kind of sort of covered that before, to some degree. We talked about it on an individual level, like your belief system is important on the individual level because it really is what guides your behavior and how you interact in the world. And well, when we begin to look at these things on a cultural or a societal level, what you're really seeing is a bunch of individuals with their belief systems commingling, and the net result is, the collective conscious that is society, So why do you think it's so important? I mean, I don't know if I just want to hear it straight out.
Sure. So I would say that this is all very important because we do need to get along with one another, and if we are willing to accept beliefs that guide major life decisions and the way we treat one another for maybe the most basic of reasons, then it's important that we take on these ideas with good reasons. Because if we have unreliable methods of reaching beliefs, then when they are employed by different people, they'll reach different conclusions and they will become irreconcilable, and this will lead to widespread violence and destruction.
Exactly. I totally agree with you. And there's something else to be said as well that I think it's going to be inevitable that when we talk about this, we're also going to have to bring up, and we've already kind of mentioned it, the human propensity to these things. It's easy to believe in a religion. A vast, vast, vast majority of the world's population is religious. And if you take, that's just a current living people. If you stretch that out to all people that have ever lived, the 100 billion plus, depending on when you start considering it as being human, even a more vast majority were religious. And I think one of the other things I think the most important thing that's behind this, it's not necessarily what we're talking about, but it does have farther back reaching implications, is when you look at what that violence you mentioned and the belief systems that when they're applied on the cultural level, it's that system of belief. It's not just Christianity, okay? It's not, you can pick your not my religion, not this religion, whatever. But if you look at it, the number of crimes the crimes that we would consider to be against humanity are just total, atrocities that have occurred have been done using the same structure that Christians and certain other religious people use to arrive at their conclusions about the world. It's not this. Sometimes it's the same message. It's, in this case, it would be, yes, it is Christianity, but the vessel that message is carried in, the human process that allows for that type of belief system to exist, belief without evidence, and so on and so forth, with 100% confidence. That's the vessel that allows mass manipulations of people to go on and form nations that commit genocides and atrocities, and while that back in the day that was still terrible, when you look at today, the power to just literally destroy and end all humanity exists in a few nations' hands, but once you've rung the bell, you can't unring it. The technology exists now. That's just a fact. And it's only a matter of time before the ability to acquire that technology could fall to anybody, And, everyone talks, just to touch on a modern political moment, everyone talks about the fear of Iran getting a nuclear weapon, Why is that? And everyone likes to talk poorly of Muslim extremism. We're not talking about Muslims in this episode. In this series, we're talking about Christians. But the same system that allows for the belief in religion that allows Islam to exist is the same system on the most fundamental level that allows Christianity to exist. And it's this system that, so long as human beings are able to fall into the system, we will face much stauncher challenges as a species. And I think that's the deeper reason why it's important for me as well. So I don't know if you have anything to add to that. I don't want to take too long on my tangent. So
sure. I think that's a good point. So now that we've established this, that our beliefs are important and that being able to prove them is also important, let's talk about whose job is it to prove their claims.
So the burden of proof then.
Right. So I mentioned this once before, but for those tuning in to this episode the first time, let's reiterate. I propose that there is a teapot, a microscopic teapot, in orbit about the planet Mars. Now, you may or may not believe me, but we'll acknowledge there's no good reason to believe me. I just made this up. So somebody challenges me on this and says, I don't believe you. I don't believe you. Right. Okay. Joe doesn't believe me. Well, Joe, can you prove that there's no such teapot around the planet Mars?
No.
Well, then, you have to believe me. There's, you have to. You can't prove that it's not true. So this this illustration was concocted by Bertrand Russell, and it's referred to as Russell's teapot. And it's an important illustration about the burden of proof. That the burden of proof ought lie in the hands of the one who makes the initial claim, and rather than the one who denies a claim.
Which just makes perfect sense when you really start thinking about the implications of that.
Right. Well, and indeed, many very nasty and nefarious regimes have been built upon shifting the burden of proof onto those who would go against the system. Not to get into specifics, but without this understanding of the burden of proof, it's very clearly seen that there are an infinite number of places to which the goalposts can be moved, and that nonsense ideas can thrive because there are limitless ways to make up an explanation with no substantiation. And so, perhaps my favorite example of this is a now famous clip from Bill O'Reilly on his show, The O'Reilly Factor, on Fox News, in which I believe, I forget the name of the person he was interviewing, an atheist, and
I'll link the video.
Okay, and somehow or another in the conversation, Bill challenges the atheist and submits that Christianity has explanatory power because, quote, the tides go in, the tides go out, never a miscommunication. You can't explain that, end quote. Now, putting aside the fact that we have a very good scientific understanding of the way tides work, even if it were the case that his guess could not explain the tides, what does this have at all to do with the actual existence of the God, which presumably Bill will claim as an explanation for the tides?
Spoiler alert.
None. That if we have no idea what causes the tides, that's it. We have no idea. This is not licensed to insert whatever explanations we want until a real explanation comes around. We have no explanation until we do.
Right. You can't, and it's okay to hypothesize, but you can't assert that hypothesis as a truth in place, Like, you can hypothesize. Like, I'm sure people people had reasons to believe why the tides went in and out before we had the scientific understanding that we're very confident now we know why the tides go in and out. And because I think we've spoken before about having the operating assumption, It is fine to have an operating assumption, an assumption that you make based on other evidence that you may have acquired beforehand that isn't true. You know that you haven't proven it to be true. You make a minor assumption. But generally speaking, this isn't what we're talking about, because Bill O'Reilly isn't isn't trying to prove the atheist in the video wrong by using evidence. He's essentially trying to poke holes in that claim and assert his belief is true without proving it, which is the same as making a claim from ignorance,
Well, yeah, it's shifting the burden of proof onto someone who didn't make a claim. And then furthermore, Bill received many comments after his clip became famous or infamous, depending on how you look at it, in which the tides were thoroughly explained to him and how they worked. And so he backpedaled on this, and he said, well, that's not really the point.
He's right, technically.
Sure, well, yeah, he is right that it's not really the point, but he says, okay, fine, you can explain the tides, but where did the sun come from and the moon?
Oh, my God.
So you see that there's an infinite number of places to which he could move the goalpost. As soon as we explain the sun or the moon, then he could ask, okay, what about this? What about this? What about this? And we could exhaust all of human knowledge. Well, we actually couldn't exhaust all of human knowledge. There's too many things that we know for any one person to go through and explain in any one lifetime.
Sure. And this isn't really the same thing, but it's easy to me remember. It's as the anecdote is, which is easier for you to determine what I haven't eaten today, or for you to determine what I have eaten today. It's not quite the same thing, but the scales are very similar.
Right.
It's infinitely more complicated to try to prove everything that I haven't eaten first. And well, it's not quite the same as moving the burden of proof. It's shifting the burden of proof is the same as telling somebody, oh, well, you can't prove to me what you ate. You had to prove to me everything you didn't eat. It's just infinity as opposed to something as a lot.
Right. It's a lot easier for me to prove that you say, let's say you ate a sandwich for lunch today, as opposed to that you didn't eat an alligator, a table, and a window, and everything else.
So where does that take us?
One thing that comes up that believers will cite as their motivation for believing despite evidence is faith, which I suppose is a little bit redundant there. The definition of faith that I propose is belief without evidence, belief for believing's sake, or belief without really knowing why. Because we'll take children, for example, who believe things because their parents told them to. This isn't a real reason, but this will develop into what they will call faith.
Yep. It's being able to assign confidence to a belief without having any real reason to, honestly.
Right.
Is another way you could spin it. But when you take the definition of, why do you believe blank? Faith. If you substitute faith for its definition, it's why do you believe in blank? I believe in blank because I believe in blank.
Yeah.
Without evidence. And the thing is, when you say it like that, when you substitute the definition for the word, it makes no sense, and no one would take you seriously. But however, when someone says the word, well, I just have faith, that seems colloquially to most people, like if I tell you I have strong faith in this, or I have faith that this will work out. People have this tendency to give you the benefit of the doubt and take that as though it's evidence.
You must have a good reason if you have faith in it.
Right,
which goes against the definition, really.
Right. If you had a good reason, why not just say the good reason? Why give faith? Right. And don't get me wrong, faith might be a good thing in shorthand for if I just looked at you, David, and I said, David, we need to leave. You might take it on faith as to why, because you might know there might not be enough time for me to explain.
We may be dead if I ask you for an explanation.
Right, and that's where it goes back to, that human need for I need to make a quick decision, but we took that little mechanism that's helped us to survive in the bush and stretched it into a justification for adopting entire belief systems.
Right. I'd also like to clarify that faith is not the same as trust. A lot of people will say, you might have and this sort of goes into your example that you just gave. You might have trust in your parents, let's say, especially when you're a child. And so they'll conflate this and say, well, you have faith in what your parents say. But no, I trust my parents because they've shown me time and again that they do what's good for me. After all, they've kept me alive for however many years it's been. I have reinforcement to trust them. Faith is like trust, but without this underlying reliability. And a real problem with it is that if faith is really a justification, then you can use it to justify any belief. Right. And we see this. It's one of the reasons why there are so many religions.
Right. And when you say belief, it isn't just religions either. You can use it to justify anything. As to take an extreme example, Charles Manson had great faith in what he was doing.
Right.
And I mean that literally. Like, he had great faith in what he was doing. He murdering those people, he didn't believe there was anything wrong with it. Don't get me wrong, like, he had the capability of understanding right and wrong, but when you can justify it with faith, it's like, oh, well, I have strong faith that this is the right thing to do. Doesn't make it right. Faith is, and it's also amazing to me how choosy people will be, where it's like there's these unspoken rules about where faith is allowed to be used and not. And I think that a lot of that comes out of tradition, and especially in where we live in the United States, where there's a strong tradition of Christianity in the country. I won't go so far as to say for certain that we are a Judeo-Christian society or based on those values, but the much easier to assert claim is that we have a strong tradition of Christianity in this country, which is, I think, pretty irrefutable. But faith is one of those words that it's got two tones when it's used, and there's a tone that's when it's used that it's supposed to be taken with reverence, and that's like, oh, have faith. When it's used standalone, it's used in that religious context, and it's just kind of colloquially been turned into this other word that means the exact same thing but is looked down on.
Right. Well, and I've talked to believers before about, that I would submit to them that you can't prove that that Christianity is true, that the teachings of Christianity are true. Or let's be more specific. You can't prove that Jesus was resurrected from the dead, let's say, for a specific claim. And I've heard the response, well, of course you can't. It's supposed to be based on faith. Right? And so this is that line of thinking that the religion itself is supposed to be based on believing for believing's sake is why we have so many religions. They all disagree, and they are seemingly impossible to reconcile because they arrive at contradicting conclusions that cannot coexist, but they're all based on the same reasoning, that we should believe for belief's sake because it's right to believe it, whatever that means. And so to me, when someone says, I believe in this because of faith, when they backpedal to that point, it's a vacuous excuse to believe without a good reason. That it's an admission of defeat. I don't have a good reason, so I say I believe on faith.
But the religion, especially Christianity, is built in such a way that that situation for each respective member, given their beliefs, will walk away thinking that they've both well defended their position, because they talk up the ability to do that. Hey, I can believe in something with no evidence and just know it as a virtue. That's virtuous in the faith. And they even call it the faith.
Well, yeah, the faith has a different definition, which
Sure.
is the religion itself.
Right, but in Christianity it is, like go to any sermon, and they'll talk, and go to any church, and you won't have to attend long before you hear people talking about how, I took it on faith and I did this and it blank, and there's a result. And the thing is, they use the result. It's also a combination of ends justifying means, Have faith now and it will be great later. And they always use the means of having faith, which when you've psychologically prepared yourself that you're confident 100% that any outcome that befalls you is good, and you make excuses for any outcome. I've seen plenty of Christians who, why do you have faith in this? It's like, I have faith and I do what I do because I do it on faith and I believe it's the right thing and I'm doing it on faith. I have no real reason to know why I'm doing this, but I know it's on faith. If that goes and fails horribly, like a man launches a business enterprise on faith and it fails horribly, before the hat drops, there's someone saying, well, it's actually the best thing that ever happened to me, because, there comes your left brain again, making up it right.
Well, yeah, because now you've learned a life lesson to not start a business, doing whatever that was.
It's mixing optimism in with a lack of evidence to create a system by which you always feel like you're doing everything's going to be fine because this is just how it was supposed to happen.
Right.
And that's one thing that humans just, I think, crave more than anything else. Most people, I feel like, would much rather have a bad reason for why something is or happened than no reason.
No reason. Mm-hmm.
And you see this all the time, there's a really interesting article I read. I'll have to cite it. It was about a man who was going through a court case, and he was on trial for committing some egregious crime, but he knew he was innocent, and he was innocent. But the fact of the matter is there was really no strong evidence to prove that he was guilty. And because of the way our justice system is, he fortunately was released, or he wasn't held in captivity. He was cleared of all charges. But the response and the way people behaved afterwards was so upset that he didn't go to jail. And you see some people where it's like, it's not that they entirely believe that he did it, but they just don't want to believe that they're never going to know. Like, there's this, humans hate not knowing and would much rather just make up their own reason why. And faith is a vehicle by which you can take what you don't know. It's like people who, I don't know if you have ever met somebody who does this, that they're so confident that everything's going to work out fine that you can watch them fail spectacularly and they're like, yeah, I meant to do that. You ever met someone who uses that phrase? That's faith. That's faith in that act of, in Christianity. It's, oh, well, it's going to be fine. Fails miserably. And, inserts an excuse based on their optimism, and in that all is just used as more not evidence to support the trust they have in the faith.
Right. So I have a tangent I'd like to go down. This is unplanned.
Oh, we've got plenty of time. So
one other interesting thing is the notion of prayer.
Okay. Or meditation, which they would hate if you called it that.
No. I mean, well, okay. Prayer and the belief that prayers are answered. Okay.
Okay.
Or that there is a reason to pray, beyond, reconciling inner conflicts and things like that. Beyond the functions associated with meditation. Praying for financial assistance in tough times, things like this.
Or for someone's health.
Right, or for someone's health.
Very common one.
And of course, every Christian who's been a Christian for not a very long time at all knows that not every prayer is answered, right? And so Christians are forced to reconcile this, that God listens to our prayers, but sometimes He doesn't answer them. Now, Christians have been thinking about this for a long time, and they've now come up with many things that they will submit as for explanations of this.
I was about to say, what do you mean? There's always an answer. Yes, no, or wait for the answer.
Right, but really, what it seems to have come down to, in my experience, is God's will be done. And so, if you pray and your prayer is answered, it was God's will that the prayer be answered. Obviously, God wouldn't answer a prayer if it weren't His will. But then, if you pray for something that maybe in their terms don't need, then your prayer isn't answered, and this was God's will. Well, if God's will happens all the time, apparently, why pray? If God is going to do what God's going to do, why does pleading on your part make a difference?
Because that's what He wants you to do. That's the answer you would get.
Right.
And that's another interesting relationship that I feel like Christians have to reconcile is, well, there's the free will problem that even Christianity has a very hard time dealing with. And there are two really huge schools within it, of which there are many sects that are divided on the issue. Both make points that in their own context seem very, they fit very well and are convincing arguments within their own scopes, but they make a lot of assumptions that you would already have to be a believer to even accept. And that's another thing too, is talking about, if it's fine with you, I want to talk about something that I've heard before that really brought into my mind a really good question. I was discussing the concept of freedom and liberty. And I mean that in the individual sense. You are just able to do what you wish, unobstructed, so long as you don't, whatever.
Right.
Well, I was asking, a person of the faith, and, how does that fit within, Christianity? And and we were kind of talking. We were talking about Christianity and the concept of if it were in governance, like if a country governed like with using the rules of Christianity. Okay, that's kind of the context for a little background. And they say, well, people do have freedom. They have freedom to do the right thing. And when I heard that, it was immediately, huge red flags, because that's not what that means. When you have freedom, he's not wrong. You do have freedom to do the right thing. But you also have freedom to do the wrong thing. And with both of those freedoms, you get to bear the responsibility of either action. But it brings into a question, what is the role of freedom in religion? When you really think about it. Especially, and I'm going to go ahead and harp on Christianity here, because a lot of fundamentalist Christians, I know plenty of moderate Christians who don't like the concept of hell. I think that's one of the most common things that you find amongst moderate Christianities. Like if you ask someone, do you believe whether hell is real or not, and they kind of squirm on the answer, like, they don't like it,
Right.
I think that's a interesting place as well, while we're being specific about Christianity, because when you think about it, and Christians will say, oh, well, you put yourself in hell, by doing whatever. But in reality, that's not the truth. Even by their own standards, it's not the truth. And it conflicts strongly with, in reality, it's, you don't really have freedom in the religious context when you say you would. And I think there's a very strong case to be made for comparing religions, especially Christianity, to extreme conditions in which humans have existed before, namely, in dictatorships. Christopher Hitchens, who is a very staunch atheist, who made a career out of writing about it and debating primarily Christians, but also people who are just religious, often spoke about Christianity as being worse than North Korea, just like, but worse than North Korea. And that, in addition to being a very inflammatory statement to sell books, I'm sure, and to sell tickets to debates, there's some interesting there's interesting arguments being made there deep down, and a lot of them, but in the end, they all boil down to using faith as the justification. I guess I took a long walk for a short drink of water there.
Right.
But it's true, and while we may not want to devote, because it would take much more than 4 episodes to go ahead and talk about Christianity in the most verbose sense, if we really wanted to talk about it, we could just get a Bible and do a Bible study as a podcast for, however many weeks it would take us to get through it. But it all comes back to that faith that is held on a pedestal as a virtue, when in reality it's nothing more than ignorance. So that's all I had to say about it, really. I know I kind of went off for a little bit, but that it's frustrating to see it that way, because there's this obvious cognitive dissonance going on when someone starts bringing up faith and using it that they don't understand, and in the street epistemologies and epistemologies all the time, you see people of differing faiths brought up. Well, how can they do the exact same thing you did and arrive at a completely different solution? And it's very hard to deal with. Like, oh, well, they have faith. And people like to claim, no, they don't have my faith, and then comes the whole, it's no more of an extension of the fallacy of, well, that's my truth, or it's my perspective. Then people will back to that corner where that's true, it is your perspective. But it's a good question, because if you can exist with that kind of cognitive dissonance, it's I would argue that it's poor for your health. And it's not my job to make you healthy. It's not our job to make you healthy. It's not anyone else's job to make you healthy, except maybe a doctor if you're paying him to. But, ultimately we each have to be responsible for ourselves. And I think that would be the biggest thing that I want someone to take away from this, is that we're not talking about Christianity because we want people to leave Christianity because, we may not like it or whatever. We're not talking about them. We're not talking about us and what we want. We're really talking about just the idea and why it might not be a good one. And we've already spent nearly 4 episodes in the past talking about why we've mentioned in at least 4 episodes of why holding on to bad ideas isn't good,
Right.
So this is kind of where it's coming into practice. And I mean, that's about all I can say about it, I don't know how much further you want to go with this tonight before we move on to the next section next week.
I think that I'm satisfied at this point with what we've done now. As was stated as was stated previously, we haven't really gotten into very many aspects of Christianity itself, but mostly things that Christians say. Because these are I wanted to dispel these first, because this tends to be the place where Christians retreat to after being presented with other arguments
and other claims.
Right. So I wanted to dispel these first, and we'll get into some real aspects of Christianity next time. In our next episode, we will be discussing the historical Jesus, eyewitness testimony, and the Bible.
Yeah, we can do that in an hour.
Yeah, all of it.
All of it. The whole thing.
The entire Bible.
The entire Bible.
Just kidding.
Please set the video to be played in 1/8 speed, or the audio to be played in 1/8 speed, because we will be speeding it up to fit it into an hour block. So, no, I'm just kidding. But that all being said, I'm really looking forward to next week to get to more of the meat of the argument. I mean, this was kind of the appetizer, and I would say and encourage anybody who listened to this and maybe had some strong objections or strong disagreements that, we welcome the feedback. Talk to us. Because we're not saying these things through microphones and putting them up on the internet through anonymity. We're not really that anonymous. We're not trying to hide behind the veil of anonymity on the internet. We really do want to, these are things that we want to talk about because we do believe they are deeply important, like you probably do. If you feel any kind of strong emotional response to this, you clearly think it's important for whatever reason. And we want to work through that too, because we do believe that, we do for certain believe that we won't, we can't know what we can't know. And who knows? Maybe you will be the person that has the ideas that we've never thought of before, that could go along with this. And if so, it might feed into our next episode. Who knows? But we are strongly encouraging feedback, especially since we're kind of transitioning into this kind of format for the holidays, and we will be doing this for 4 weeks. Mm-hmm. I mean, I guess it's safe to go ahead and commit now. If I hadn't said it last week, I don't like making strong program commitments, because then I can't do things that I think are really cool. I have to keep my word and all. Mm-hmm. But I'm really looking forward to it. Getting these 4 episodes, well, now 3 remaining episodes knocked out, and I think we're planning on taking a break for a week. Mm-hmm. So we're looking forward to that. I guess at this point, if you were just interested in the conversation, that's all we had to say. Mm-hmm. I wanted to do a brief state of the podcast.
Oh, okay. Some housekeeping, as Sam Harris would put it.
Yeah, some housekeeping. Sam Harris would put it. Shilling, as I wrongly say.
Which we may talk about soon.
That's true. It's true. A couple of things. David and I we've been doing this. This will be our 9th episode, and I think we mentioned last week that we really enjoyed doing it, and we were going to try to do better. Well, we hope that this week you'll notice that the audio quality is improved, and it's not because David finally stop being lazy and doing a good job editing the audio, or that I did a good job of actually striping it up to YouTube. It's that we finally ponied up, and because of some generous donations we received through our Patreon and small contributions from ourselves, because we do find this important, and we were able to kind of go ahead and afford some upgrades to our microphones, and we hope that it has made your listening much more pleasurable and easygoing on your ears. One of the biggest pieces of feedback we have yet received is how grating we sound. Regardless of how good the content was, apparently our voices sounded really grating before. But
wouldn't it be gloriously ironic if people thought that this sounded worse?
It would be gloriously ironic, and in that case, well,
tough.
Well, I mean, we've still got the old mics. We could throw them back on. I'm probably sure I could get a refund. Patron's not getting his money back, but to him out there, I know you watch. We really do appreciate. We do appreciate that. I don't want to, throw too much your way.
No doxing.
No doxing, of course. This is a no dox zone. Dox zone. That's really hard to say.
A dox-free zone.
Dox-free zone, exactly. So that being said, as I mentioned earlier, we have 3 more installments for our Talks on Christianity, and then we will be taking off a week, which going into the new year, we'll do probably a little bit longer one of these. I feel like would be responsible of us. But just to let you know that we are currently kind of going through a phase where we're wanting to do some minor expansion and talk about some more things we can bring, more content we can bring to all of you listening. And this is a good time where if you have suggestions to bring them up, so that when we go have our little meeting on our week off to discuss what we're going to do and how we want to make improvements, we can bring those into the fold. So if you have any suggestions, feel free to reach out to us on Twitter, comment on a video. We have a Patreon page, and our email address is even on our YouTube page, if you so choose to use it. We check all of those things regularly, so that's mainly our housekeeping business. Anything to add, David?
No, I have nothing to add.
All right. Oh, we appreciate you for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe, all the other things. Shill, thank you. And we will see y'all next week with our next installment. So, Fauxlosophers.
Fauxlosophers.